Bodega. Part 18. I don't like it, said Bodega, glaring out of the viewport on the bridge of the Disco Volante. He stood, hands on hips, shaking his head, staring at his hideout that sat motionless in the small asteroid field. Maybe she's on vacation, said Nebish. I don't think so. She'd have told me, replied Bodega. He ran his hand down one side of his face, then the other. And Nebish thought for one moment he'd seen a tiny spark fly from Bodega's stubble. Nebish trusted Bodega's trouble sense more than he trusted the ship's sensors. He may have been a computer nut, but he also believed that evidence spoke for itself. Bodega was never wrong. If he thought there was trouble, there was trouble. End of story. Want to send Varu aboard? Check it out? Asked Nebish, cocking his head. Ain't fair to send him out there just because he's a robot, Neb, said Bodega, turning and walking towards the cargo hold. He is a robot, though. Why risk a life? He ain't a robot. He's a friend of mine, said Bodega, and that's that. Fine. Wish we had a drone or something, sighed Nebish. We'll go, called Bodega, and Rab too. And with that, Nebish could hear him readying his lasgun. 5 minutes later, they filed out of the Gretham insertion shuttle. Rab had his gore hammer ready, Bodega his las rifle, and Nebish his needle pistol. Reed had been needed back at corporate HQ for some big meeting, so he wasn't present, and Varu was staying behind on the Gretham. Sheila! Sheila! Called Bodega, rifle raised. Reckon she'd take off. Been away for a few weeks, man, said Rab, checking the corners of the docking port while sipping from a can of spatial brew. The base wasn't large enough to accommodate the Disco Volante, but if there was trouble, Rab was glad they hadn't put all their eggs in this one basket. Something else I'm worried about, said Bodega. Police, bristled Rab, raising his hammer slightly. I got a message from Tan a couple days ago, said Bodega. Said he'd wired me the money up front. 500 million squirrels, Rab. That's the kind of money makes a friend an enemy. Where did you find Sheila anyway? Asked Nebish. Recruitment agency. Couldn't think of anyone I knew that would want to push papers and make scoffy all day, said Bodega ruefully. Flarv, what if she's done a runner with the Skrells? Asked Rab. If she did, I'll find her, said Nebish, smiling. Let's check the office, said Bodega. They carefully moved through the cramped base, checking corners and angles, wary and ready for battle. You guys check Sheila's office, I'll check mine, said Bodega. Rab and Nebish began turning over papers on Sheila's desk. Nebish began checking her computer. As Bodega entered his office, he saw a note pinned to the whiteboard, a piece of paper folded in two. On the front it said Bodega, so Bodega lifted the folded flap. He heard a tiny snick sound. Behind the flap, embedded in the whiteboard, was a small green disc about the size of his palm. It had a digital readout on the front that flashed into life, displaying red numbers, 00.04. That's a bomb then, thought Bodega calmly. When everything was about to go flavy, Bodega's mind became tranquil. This was partly a gift and partly training. He'd also been in these kinds of situations so many times that he was able to assess each one with the detached nonchalance of a man mowing his lawn in his dressing gown. First things first, thought Bodega. Gotta seal this room. He glanced left and saw Rab about 5 meters away. Their eyes met for a split second, and Rab instantly knew just how flavy things were about to get. That big Tartanian lug had the instincts of a Zarkpo the ingenious leopard. Bodega slapped the big red emergency vacuum seal button, and the door between him and Rab slammed shut with a surprisingly loud hiss and a hearty clonk. 00.03. Bodega began breathing as rapidly as he could. He was getting as much oxygen into his bloodstream as possible because pretty soon he was going to have to empty his lungs, and last time he checked, 3 years ago, they still hadn't found a way to make space breathable. While he was doing this, he thumbed the wide-angle blast switch on his las gun and turned towards the viewport at the back of the office. 00.02. This was the spare second. Some more breathing. Bodega could see a small car-sized asteroid behind the base through the viewport. He leaned backward as much as he could and raised one leg in the air like he was about to start some kind of crazy drunken marching. He raised the rifle. 00.01. Bodega exhaled as hard as he could until he started to see stars around his peripheral vision. He pulled the trigger on the lasgun. The rear of the room vanished in a blinding flash, and Bodega was blasted out into space along with everything around him. His desk, a moldy cup of coffee, paperwork, his computer, a chair. 00.00. The tiny charge went off behind him, but Bodega was already traveling so fast he never felt it. He felt all the moisture on his tongue evaporate, and his eyeballs began to freeze over. He couldn't really see much of anything, and for the first time he heard real silence. The true, total silence of the void. He also saw that asteroid coming up real fast at his 12 o'clock. He brought his feet together so he looked like some kind of insane cowboy missile system in flight. His ground boots maybe had enough juice in them to slow him for impact. When the asteroid was scary close, he fired the boots by tapping the heels together just so. The G-force of the deceleration brought more stars to his already clouded vision, but a moment later he landed on the asteroid, a tiny plume of dust and pieces of rock erupting at his feet. He was about 5 seconds into this unwanted spacewalk, and he knew he had around 10 to 15 seconds left before he blacked out. He turned carefully to look back towards the base. One side of it was spewing gas into the void, and it listed badly, tumbling slowly so that it was about to go end over end. He could see the Disco Volante parked up around 1 kilometer away. He had to cross that distance soon, or he was going to die of being in space. Being in space was flarving awful. It was insanely cold, but he could also feel his skin burning badly from sunburn. His tongue was bone dry, his eyes freezing over like a windshield on a frosty morning. He was also starting to see beads of blood spill out into space, presumably from his body. Hell, he needed that red stuff inside him, he was pretty sure. Keep it together, pard, he told himself. Bending down carefully, he reached into his sock and pulled out a tiny shock charge. These things were mostly used for building entry. The blast was shaped so that a wave of force could be thrust through a wall to stun people on the other side. If he could plant the charge facing outwards, it might be able to get this little roid moving towards the disco. He slapped the charge on a spot he felt pretty sure was in line with the ship and ripped the go cord. A moment later, it went off silently, and Bodega noted with detached interest that the roid was now rocketing through space towards his ship, but was off angle by about 20 degrees. Close enough, maybe. He saw the Gretham spiral out of the dying station and begin burning away. The disco fired up his engines, and he saw it turning rapidly on the spot like a carousel. Varu looking for him. No time to run a scan, the robot was eyeballing it. 5 seconds left, till Bodega blacked out. The disco was around half a click now. He fired his lasgun wildly into space, trying to get Varu's attention. It worked. The disco froze for a moment, then burned hard towards him. With the last of the juice in the scram boots, Bodega launched himself off his rocky steed and held one arm out in front. He guessed because his brain was saying, "Pard, that ship is moving awful fast towards you," as he began to black out before seeing Varu in the cockpit of the disco, and then nothing. Bodega awoke, feeling swollen and extremely flarvy in his bed aboard the Disco Volante. His friends gathered around him like a bunch of old grandmothers. Bodega sat up stiffly in bed. He looked around the room, blinked his scratchy eyes a few times. "Okay, we got a new mission, fellers," he rasped. "I've decided I want to get my dog back." The end.
Oh,